So, as Archie mentioned, my name is Paul Muller. I put the scum in Scrum Master. We're going to talk a bit about DevOps. Archie mentioned in the opening, I've been involved with the DevOps community going back. Probably first interaction was back in 2008, 2009 with Damon Edwards, John Willis, probably some names you're familiar with, and of course then Gene Kim, who I helped collaborate with on the Phoenix project, which I think we had a show of hands earlier on. A lot of you have read that, right? And from the earliest days of, I guess, getting into this whole DevOps movement, actually, quick point. Who's an ITIL person, or who was an ITIL person in the room? A few of you all embarrassed. Yes. I was on that change advisory board where we just said no to everything. Yeah, you're all laughing because it's true. So I was one of those guys. I've been in systems and IT management as well, back when I had hair. So it was a long time ago. And when I first wrapped my brain around DevOps, I had an epiphany. It was like, okay, I get this. This is going to help us move a lot faster. This is going to help us deliver business value. And I've been evangelizing it both internally to the company I work for, but also externally to banks, to governments around the world. And I don't know about you, if you've been a DevOps evangelist internally, you probably get that look when you start talking to people like you're a crazed lunatic. What do you mean we'll let developers? Yeah, that's you. I'll push changes into production. You want to what? So it took me a long time to get this sort of, I guess, enthusiasm up, and it's great to see this rising tide of DevOps, and I do think that next year will be the year that DevOps goes mainstream. But for today, I thought when we're talking about the skills of the future, what I thought we'd do is something different and look at what could cause DevOps to fail. Could this be the last year that we're here talking about DevOps, and hence the title for today's presentation. So let's look at a couple of things as we do this. So the whole discussion of this event, and I love the theme, by the way, because it was thought-provoking, is what are the skills for the future? I think we've got a fairly good understanding of what the skills for today are, and maybe the next 12 months, but what does it look like as we fast forward over the next few years? So I thought I'd speculate on that a little, but before I did that, I thought we'd speculate on and reflect on the skills of the past. Okay, so this is a quick pop quiz. Can anyone tell me who this lady is? Who said Grace Hopper? Give the man a prize. Does anyone know what she's doing right there? She's unleashing hell on Earth. No, that's not a nuclear control device. She's creating COBOL. The thing is, though, during that time, this is back in the days when computer science was literally science, right? And bugs were actual animals that got caught in valves and relays. The point being is that back then we used to keep the business out of the data center. Remember the sticky carpet we used to put in front of the data center? That wasn't to catch dust. It was to stop unsuspecting business executives before they got in the room, right? The point, we were the scientists, and if they wanted access to the stuff, they needed to talk to us. So a very, very different mentality back then. And unfortunately, for the next half a century, not a lot changed. I mean, for one thing, there's 3 men watching one woman do all the work. Am I right, ladies? Nothing's changed. And props to Grace, because of course, along with Ada Lovelace, proof that women have been pioneers of this industry from the very get-go. So I actually reflect on the comment, we need more women at these sorts of events, we need more women presenting because, women are some of the best technologists on the planet and certainly want to see them represent, right, ladies? Awesome. All right, so with that, we had Grace. And this sort of set the tone for the next 50 years of IT, right? And that was fundamentally based on work several centuries earlier. This is a guy called Adam Smith, wrote a book called On the Wealth of Nations, several centuries ago. And his whole thesis was, he had a couple of different ideas. He's actually Scottish. He's on the £10 note. Most people think he's American because the Americans took this idea and ran with it. The point was that he had this model for making money. Efficiency. And that he had this model of a pin factory. Who's heard of the pin factory story, right? So rather than one person making all the pins, putting them in the boxes, wrapping them up and getting them ready for sale, if one person, for example, made the box, one person extruded the pin, one person sharpened it, one person put the head on it, one person packed it, if each person did that job individually, we'd be substantially more efficient. Now, it's an intuitive notion that pretty much sparked the Industrial Revolution and drove almost 100% of the way we run businesses today. So as we start to talk about DevOps, we're actually trying to crack the back of a multi-century old behavioural problem. So if we keep talking about culture, there's a reason for it. We're trying to change not 50 years of culture, we're trying to change several centuries of culture. What that wound up with, though, is a high It's a low trust culture. I don't know if anyone's seen this meme before. I absolutely love it. Because basically what happened in our model within IT is everyone who was doing their bit thought they were effing awesome and that everyone else was a knuckle-dragging moron, right? We've got security people in the room? Yeah. Department of No? Yeah. Yeah. I want to make it no. I haven't asked the question yet. I know, but it's safer if we just don't do anything. So we wound up in this situation where everyone was against everybody else, right? A very low trust, high pathological culture. What that also led to was a tremendous bottleneck in the flow of work. And the genesis of DevOps, I think it was you that asked the question earlier this morning, was where did this term come from? And it actually came, funnily enough, from an Agile conference where there's a guy called Patrick Dubois, you could kind of call the godfather of DevOps, a wonderful technologist and a great Agile developer, realised there was this huge impedance mismatch that was building up because on the left-hand side of this diagram, we were running weekly, bi-weekly sprints, right? We were producing all this work product at a great rate. But it was hitting this brick wall as we went to release. And it wasn't getting to the other side because, of course, on the operations side of the house, we were running with that kind of mentality of change advisory boards. 60% of all outages are caused by unplanned and unscheduled changes or poorly implemented changes. And therefore, we would stop those changes, right? So huge amount of work product and an impedance mismatch on the other side. And DevOps can trace itself back to one profound question that he asked back at an Agile day many, many years ago, and Andrew Clay Schaefer was the only guy who turned up to that meetup, to that unmeeting, which is the question, what about Agile for operations? And that simple yet profound question got the wheels turning. And you could argue is why we're here today. How do we remove the impedance mismatch between those two sides of the business? And if we look at what's happened since then, the good news is we've got a whole bunch of knowledge we've documented about how to do that. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've created a huge, opus of work. This is a great book called Leading Transformation by Gary Groover, who did a huge amount of work on shipping code through complex systems at a number of different companies. Great book. It's like a how-to for DevOps. I'd actually argue, Gene and I are good friends, this actually is, in some respects, the companion to the Phoenix project. It's like those two things go hand in hand. And of course, we've got the DevOps handbook, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks. The point being is we've started to codify a lot of this stuff, which is great. Unfortunately, as with all industries, we've also got a lot of people who kind of think they understand DevOps, right? Yeah, well, yeah, we're doing DevOps. We just don't do Agile, stand-up CI code or any of that other kind of hipster stuff where people have beards and, wear sandals to work. We don't do any of the actual DevOps. But yeah, sure, I've got a dev and I've got an ops, and therefore I must be doing DevOps, right? So we've got a lot of charlatans. The whole notion then, as we started to think about it, those theory of constraints, and a few people have mentioned it this morning, and just a quick refresher, the theory of constraints goes like this: identify the constraint, exploit the constraint, subordinate all other work product to the tempo of that constraint. In other words, don't do bi-weekly sprints if you can't actually put it to production any faster than that, because it's going to go off like bananas in the sun. Elevate the organisation. So take that constraint and try and find a way to remove it. Try and find a way to break that constraint, and then rinse and repeat, or can't stop, won't stop, whatever you like to call it. My point being is that it's a very simple methodology, and I would argue to understand the future of DevOps and the future skills we need to think about where the constraints are in the systems today and moving forward. And I'd argue that if we look at the constraints, most of them have gone. Price of technology is plummeting. A Raspberry Pi costs a couple of rand, and you can fit it in the palm of your hand, right? I mean, that's a whole computer. The idea that you could even buy that 10 years ago is mind-blowing. Infrastructure provisioning. I think we've kind of cracked the back of that problem, right? You could argue we could do automatic infrastructure provisioning, infrastructure as code. Change advisory board. I think we've figured out how to get out of our own way. Yeah, you'd argue that that's pretty much there. We're all doing automated regression testing, right? The sort of nervous laughter I love at a DevOps conference. Yeah, we push code to production untested. Who are the testers? The customer. Scalability, we've kind of cracked the back of that problem, right? So we've got Erlang, we've got things like Lambda, so we've now built these massively scalable systems. And if not, computer scientists have figured out how to crack the back of the problem. As I said, another great Japanese term, kotsu, right, means a little bit at a time in Japanese, step by step. So we're kind of getting to the back of this problem of everything is code. We're using the repo. And security, as Jason just spoke about, we've kind of named the problem. right? So we understand that security is now one of the great constraints, and we're doing things like rugged DevOps or DevSecOps, depending on how you like to describe it, to start to automate things like static code analysis, to do things like traceability so that we can prove compliance. Rather than having to enforce it, we can at least prove it post-mortem. So we've kind of cracked the back of a lot of problems that even 4 years ago you would have said, forget it, you're just dreaming, right? So what does it look like as we start to fast forward? I've got a couple of thoughts. Now, I want to be clear here. This is my kind of sense of what sort of skills do we need to develop out into the future. What would we be talking about for the next 3 or 4 years? I don't have the answers to the questions. So if anything, it's a little bit like Patrick. I'm asking questions that hopefully the smart people in this room will be presenting on topics like this for the next 2 or 3 years. And I think of it like this: waterfall, and I'll explain what I mean by waterfall in a minute. It's kind of what you think it means, but it's a bit bigger than that. Developers, definitely a constraint. Change fatigue, I'll explain what I'm talking about there. Obsolescence is a huge one, and DevOps itself, right? I have met my enemy, and it is me, right? So let's walk through each of them in turn. I was going to put a picture of Victoria Falls, and then I thought that'd be silly because I'm Australian, so I should put a picture of a waterfall from Australia. So this is actually Ayers Rock. Believe it or not, it does rain in the middle of the desert, and when it does, you get that wonderful effect on the dirty great rock that we've got out in the middle of the outback. So why am I talking about waterfall in this context? Waterfall is a problem because we are a really insular group within IT, right? We keep on talking about business IT alignment. I mean, have you ever heard the accounting team go, let's talk about accounting business alignment? It wouldn't happen, right? Let's talk about HR business alignment. Wouldn't happen. But for whatever reason, we like to talk about us a lot. In the case of waterfall, we usually talk about waterfall in the context of us, but waterfall is a much bigger problem because, again, going back to Adam Smith's way of working, the business runs with a waterfall methodology, and the sins of the father turn out to be the sins of the son in many cases. Because we apply, in a business context, we apply what I'd call Hoover Dam thinking to IT problems. Right, Hoover Dam thinking. For those of you, the Hoover Dam, one of the biggest dams in the world ever built, and of course you've got the Aswan down here in at least in Egypt, in North Africa. The whole point of this, a really big civil project that had a couple of important characteristics. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. The build period was comparatively short as compared to the run period, which was measured in you could argue, centuries. Sure, there was maintenance to do, but the fundamental notion of turning water into power wasn't going to change at any period in time. And in fact, during the building of the dam itself, the properties of concrete didn't change while they were building the dam. Now, compare that to silicon, which ironically happens to be built from the same substance as the dam, and it's completely different, right? The properties of technology are changing while we're building the stuff we're building, number one. And number two is the expected lifespan of what we're building is measured in years at best, months typically, right? Because one of the important points about technology in our game, as we heard this morning from the CEO, was, or is, that technology is the product for our customers, right? It is the thing that represents value for them in many cases. And what we know in our competitive world is no sooner do we release our technology than the competition wakes up and strikes back. So this whole notion that we would build it and then sweat the asset for 50 years, relatively speaking unchanged, is a complete fallacy. So I think one of the first things we need to do is stop thinking project, where's Natasha? Project, my apologies, and start thinking product. And by that I mean thinking, I'm from Silicon Valley, we have product managers. Those people wake up every morning, they understand the competition, they work with their developers to build something that can compete, either match the features or beat the features of the competition. They release it, and no sooner do they release it than they need to be thinking about the next battle that will take place as a result of them releasing their technology. Another important point, think about project teams. What do we do with them? We get them together, we give them the goal. When the project is done, we disband them all, right? We send them all back off into their little silos. We actually accentuate this Adam Smith problem. But if you were, say, at Apple and you were working on the iPhone, do you think they'd actually send all of the developers and all of the engineers away and bring a whole group of new people together for the next project? No, they don't, because they continue to work on that product over a period of time. Same is true of Google, right? They keep the product teams together over the lifetime of that product. Sure, people will move in and out of it, but it's not the wholesale set-up, tear-down that we typically associate with projects. So I'd say number one is we've got to start thinking project, not product. Sorry, product, not project. Second big problem, imagine that we start to deliver stuff faster. Imagine we remove all the constraints around operations and security. Where does the next logical constraint appear? And I'd argue it's actually developers themselves. Right? And the great news is we're doing some fantastic work here in South Africa around the coding days. It's absolutely brilliant. Bringing some of the work back on shore. But I think one of the challenges we're going to have, and I hear this all over the world, we can't get the talent we need. We can't find the developers we need. And in a world where software is business and business is software, that's a significant problem. So obviously, training is a really important part of that process, but I think there's also another focus. Who was it that mentioned Uber this morning? Again, I think it was the CEO of F&B. We talked about Uber, right? Think about Uber. What did Uber do? Well, Uber didn't invent the car, they didn't invent the smartphone, they didn't invent the app, they didn't invent GPS, they didn't invent payment systems. They certainly didn't invent the driver. So what did they do? Right? What they did was they integrated. They created a customer experience integrated from what I would argue was commonly available technology, in many cases with well-defined or exposed APIs and interfaces. And again, I think Jason made the observation, we are turning into an industry, certainly of engineers and developers, but also integrators. So modularity and integration, I think, is the next great argument or the next great battle for us to focus on. How do we think about building organisations that are platforms that can be integrated both internally and externally? The second thing I think we need to do related to that is this idea of IKEA for IT. Who here has ever made their own furniture? None of you, right? A few of the carpenters. Who's actually assembled their own furniture and found pieces left over, right? But, you know, the handy Allen key. Now, when I talk to developers and operations people about this, they start to freak out. They're like, what you want to do me out of a job? I'm like, no, IKEA actually hires some of the smartest designers and engineers on the planet, because to make something that an idiot like me can assemble with instructions that have not a single word of any language written on them takes a tremendous amount of skill, discipline, and design sensitivity. So there's absolutely tons of work for us to do, but we need to think differently. There is not a shortage of work in a digital economy. We've got to stop hoarding the work and start to figure out how we can liberate people's ideas and creativity by making things more modular and creating this sort of self-assembly. And again, I like the phrase citizen developer. How do we empower the business to start to do more of the development itself rather than having to come to us all the time? Next one. Who's had... this is a picture from a TV, where the TV was wanting a software update. Who's tired of software that wants to be updated on their smartphones or everything? Yeah, right? You're all there like that little red dot going, oh, there's another application that wants to be updated. And you know it's a problem when one of the US senators actually starts talking about the fact that he's sick of his apps constantly being updated. But I bring this up for an important reason. I was talking to a client once, which was a motor manufacturer in Germany, and I said, we're going to help you deliver software faster to the business. And he said, Paul, you know, that's a wonderful sentiment, but we're not going to do it. I'm like, why? He goes, we're a unionised shop. If we ship software changes down to the factory floor, we have to retrain our employees. If we have to retrain the employees, that becomes part of their reward and their salary goes up because they've been retrained. Think about it, right? Again, consequence that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. It is an important constraint though, right? I guess what I'm talking about is this, is that as we start to ship more and more software, as we remove the constraints of developers and technology, the constraint becomes the user themselves and the sheer rate at which they can accept and adopt this change. So design and designing for affordances, designing for the ability for the consumer to be able to discover your new application, your new functionality, and to be able to adopt it's really important. I talk about affordance. For those of you who are not familiar with it, affordance is this is probably the best simile I could give. Actually, you've got a great example over here. If you walk up to this door over here, there's a handle on it that says push. Why would you push a handle? I mean, seriously, that's how dumb that design is. It needs an instruction on it to tell you how to use it. It's a door. It's not like they just invented them. So this idea that if it's a plate, if it's a push plate, you push it. If it's a handle, you pull it, is an affordance. It just makes sense. You look at it. You don't need to put a sign on there telling the user how to operate it. Now think about your own software. Have you designed it with affordances or discoverability such that your users can just figure it out as they go? So importantly, when we think about DevOps, it's not just a technology issue, it's a design and human factors issue. And one of the problems I have when I go to a lot of these conferences, we spend a lot of time talking about how we're so good at shipping code faster, and we don't stop to measure whether the code itself is being consumed by the poor, unsuspecting bastards we're inflicting it upon. So I'll take a page from the late, great Steve Jobs, who said that technology alone's not enough, that it's technology married with liberal arts, married with humanities, that yields the result that makes our hearts sing. And I think if we look to the future of a conference like this, I'd love to see more people coming from the humanities, coming from outside of the technology world, and maybe shaking us up a little bit about our assumptions around these things called users. Obsolescence. So we're shipping more code more quickly. Okay, for that, a few of you have just gone, 8-inch floppy disks, right? If I've got time, I might tell you a true story about floppy drives later on. It's not blue. But one of the problems you have, again, as you start to ship more technology more frequently, and even if your users start to consume it, you actually create an inbuilt problem of obsolescence. Because as you version every app, as you version every interface, as you get better at innovating, you're actually creating tomorrow's technical debt that you will need to pay down at some time. This isn't the Aswan Dam, right? You will need to pay down that debt, and you'll usually need to pay it down sooner than you expect. So we need to start to think about obsolescence. So there's a bunch of great work around this. Martin Fowler's strangler patterns. Anyone sort of out there familiar with this, right? So I have a point of view that architecture matters. Anyone in the room an enterprise architect or was an enterprise architect? I know you were. You're guilty. The other department, no. Yep, you can't do it. Why? It's not part of our standards. Okay, but this works. I don't care. You'll ruin the beauty of this diagram that I created in, what do you use, Visio? I guess it's Visio, right? Visino. Yeah, you can't do it. It's not in the Visio. Sorry, dude. No, but architecture absolutely matters in this world. And again, we give it short shrift because the decisions we make today are the problems of tomorrow. So we need to start to think about not only how do we take our legacy applications, Hogan, and... Yeah, I said that right here. But hey, you got to laugh. So I'm assuming, where there's humour, there's truth. No, but seriously, so we're taking our legacy apps and try and figure out a mechanism by which we can confer additional agility. And again, I can't recall which speaker was talking about the fact we've got to take these DevOps concepts from Unix and apply them to all parts of the organisation. Because again, the constraints are still there. They're just hiding and moving around to different places. So thinking about things like strangler patterns, about taking our legacy applications and surrounding them with APIs so that they, again, confer some of the advantages. I'll be wrapping up shortly. The other part we need to be conscious of is the fact that every decision, every product we make is a prediction, right? We don't know. We build something on the assumption our users might love it, but they might hate it. It's wrong. So what that means is not only are we making decisions about architectures and legacies, but we may actually have to reverse those decisions sooner than we expect because we might not have actually anticipated our customers' needs correctly. One of my favourite books that's not related to IT, How Buildings Learn. Who's read it? Excellent book by a guy called Stuart Brand who talks about something called pace layering. Right, or shearing layers. The idea that a building site has a certain lifespan, the building framework or the structure might have another lifespan, the stuff inside it has a different lifespan again, and that you can think about your architectures in the construct of how rapidly elements of that architecture are likely to change. So a really great book that every time I read it, at least anyway, although it's about buildings, I keep hearing IT. Fabulous book, well worth reading. Last part, let's talk about DevOps, and I'll wrap up as quickly as I can before Candace rips my arms off. DevOps. DevOps itself is, I think, one of our biggest problems, right? As I said, so you name it, so it shall be. Who's at this DevOps conference? I'm going to guess developers and operations people. Right? Huh? Managers are here as well. Oh, that word, the M word. The point being is when a lot of people think about DevOps, the portmanteau of DevOps actually constrains our thinking. It is part of the problem in and of itself because we keep bringing the developers and the operations people. Thank God we've got some security people here now. But as you've just heard, the need is actually substantially broader than that. And I argued that if we keep talking about DevOps like it's just Dev and Ops, we're going to die together but alone. Right? We'll have this wonderful group of people who'll just be this cul-de-sac of IT methodology. So I'd actually ask that we start to think like Patrick DeBile. What about Agile for XXX? Right? Insert any word you like. Agile for facilities. True story. I had one client who said to me, we're moving to Agile. We want to get our teams co-located in the same building. They went to their facilities people, and their facilities people said, they said, we only redesign the floor plan every 5 years. We just finished. You'll need to wait another 4. So, another constraint. So how do we get the facilities people on board with this new way of thinking? What about marketing? Same discussion. We want to put stuff in front of customers. Are marketing running with the same sort of cadences? Where are their constraints in this process? Sales, similar sort of thing. How do we train them? How do we enable them? If we're talking omni-channel, releasing all these products, are they the bottleneck? What about hiring itself? That's a huge problem right now. Yeah, we think in a very traditional waterfall way about hiring people. And finance is my pet peeve. I'm happy we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I'd love to talk about this because nothing will reinforce waterfall culture in your organisations. Anything, the worst sin you could have is the finance people coming to you and going, you've got your annual budget, what's the plan? And you're like, 2-week sprints, and they're like, where are you running to? So we've got to crack a bigger problem, right? Which is how do we get the business out of this waterfall annual financial year thinking, or the other one, right? Which is your last 2 weeks of the financial year, use it or lose it, right? So you start creating these bridges to nowhere. So we've got a huge number of problems to deal with. Bottom line, again, in summary, products not projects. Empower citizen developers. Start to design for adoption. How do we build in those affordances? Architecture matters, and bring a friend to the next conference, right? Someone who's not from IT. With that, I want to wrap up with Adam Smith. Adam Smith actually saw the beginnings of the stupidity, even as he coined the concept of the Industrial Revolution. He said, the man whose whole life is spent performing a few simple operations, and I'll paraphrase it, generally becomes as ignorant and stupid and as ignorant as is possible for a human creature to become. And I think, if we've learnt anything over the last couple of centuries, is that we're pretty good at doing the stupidity stuff. So with that, I want to wrap up. And guys, true love never dies. We just need to open the doors to other parts of the business. Thank you so much.